If we found 7 typical 5-year-olds to represent today's UK, what would their stories reveal? Today, Danny will discuss post-pandemic Britain's most pressing issues. What do we miss when we focus only on the super rich and not on the most deprived? How can we reverse the trends, leaving all children worse off than their parents were? Welcome to Conway Hall, Danny Dorling.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yep, good. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and why I've done this, and then about the book. We were talking earlier about doing talks in schools, and we both do talks to school children, and the issue of how do you cope with calming the children down or getting them interested. It's not necessarily the most exciting thing in the world when they're told that some old person's going to be talking at them. I went to what I call a normal school, and I think I'm qualified to say what a normal school is, because as you're going to discover, I do numbers and count things and try and work out what is average, what is different, who has more, who has less. And the school I went to, which was in Oxford, to get the children to calm down at the beginning, I tell them that if they went to this school, they're more likely to die on the streets of Oxford than they are to go to my university in the city. It's a simple fact. You have to be careful when talking to children or anybody about things that are emotive or upsetting. But if you want to get people to be quiet, that's one way of doing it. And then, of course, you've got to keep their attention. And you mustn't be boring. I have some pictures for you. The reason I have the pictures is I much prefer it when you look at the pictures and not at me. But I'll forget them in a bit. So I went to a normal school, an average school, not a poor school, not a rich school. It was actually bang in the middle of the distribution of results that children got. It wasn't a school that was particularly tough. It wasn't a school that was particularly soft. It had the national average number of children going to university from it, which back then was about 2%. Not that 2% of children went to university when I was 18, but that from the middle school, the median in the country, it was 2%. Because there was these schools where almost everybody went to university. And that's how we got 6, 7, 8% going to university back then. And there were schools where nobody went. And then there were schools in the middle where a tiny, tiny number went. And I'm one of those kids. I was no good at writing at all. I was the last child in a class of 30 to learn to read. I had pretty remedial English still by the age of 16, 17 or 18. What I could do was maths. I could do maths, I could do numbers. I went off to university to do maths, statistics, computing and geography. Because what I really wanted to do is economics. But I thought the way you learn about economics is by doing these things. The picture you've got in front of you is a strange map of the world where the countries of the world have their size drawn in proportion to the number of children about 10 years ago. So about 2 billion children. And you can see that the UK is relatively small. We're actually about 0.5% of the world's children. India is large, China is large, USA is not terribly important. If you like, that's a kind of map of the future. I'm interested in taking numbers and turning them into pictures and statistics about the world to try to look at things differently. And I'll get on to 7 children in a minute, but I just wanted to give you an idea of background. So, I did a book a few years ago called Slow Down. It's a very simple book in a way, in that the point of the book was to say that most things are actually slowing down. There was a premier of Canada called Justin Trudeau who was very good at sound bites, and one of his sound bites was, "It feels like everything is going faster than ever before because the world is speeding up, but in future it will never feel as if it's as slow as it is now. Globalization's going quicker and quicker," that kind of thing. Complete bollocks, and really easy to measure. All you do is you take a set of things, such as GDP growth or number of people on the planet, rise in life expectancy, number of inventions being made, and you measure the rate of change, and you find out that bar 4 things, everything appears to be slowing down. And this is the kind of thing that interests me, because it's quite important. If things are slowing down, but people think they're going faster and faster, it matters. The things that weren't slowing down were the one I'm showing you there on the screen. That's carbon emissions. So they're going up over time. There's a little red dot. How many people have been following the little red dot? Yeah, you're like cats do this as well. I don't know if we've got, yeah, I've got a little red dot there as well. You can follow it round. It's amazing what human attention's like. Anyway, there's a little red dot, and you can see the carbon emissions rising. They're actually accelerating towards the end. Here's exactly the same data. You're going to get graphs, I'm afraid, but I will talk about children more and not go through the graphs as much later. Exactly the same data, but instead of showing it in the conventional way, I'm now showing on the horizontal scale the rate of change. The vertical scale is exactly the same as what you just saw. It's the amount going is higher per year, but if you have a look, you can see that the best thing that can happen for carbon emissions is that you have a recession. It ends just before the pandemic. That was really good for getting carbon emissions down. And cynically, the worst thing you can do for carbon emissions is you have a summit in Rio or Paris or somewhere. Because if you have a look, okay, it's only 3 data points, but every time we've all got together and had some accords around the world saying we're going to do something, we kind of go, we've done something. And then, partly by coincidence and economic growth, the emissions rise. But because that graph leans this way towards me, it means it's accelerating. Only 4 things are accelerating: carbon emissions, the surface temperature of the planet, not just going up, but on average going up slightly faster each year than the year before, which is worrying. Number of students in the world is accelerating, not just rising, but obviously there's a limit. That's going to, can't carry on. Everybody, once everybody's gone to university, it's kind of at the end of that. And the last one was flights. Number of people flying is not just going up in the world, but going up faster on average than the year before. But at the same time, most people in the world never fly. Most people in the world will never fly. It's something like a quarter of flights taken by 1% of people in the UK. Average social class in Ryanair and EasyJet is ABC1. Right? We live in a very skewed world. And there are some things which are remarkably good news. This is world population. UN projections, about 6-7 years out of date. So they've got us heading towards 11 billion people. It's now looking to be nearer 10, because every time the United Nations updates its figures on the number of children being born in the world, it turns out there are fewer than before. I find this really interesting. And the number's still going up, but per year it's going up less and less and less. And the main reason that this figure is rising isn't actually births anymore. Peak baby, the real peak was 1990, and there was a little peak for their kids. That's all ended. It's you lot. You are annoyingly, or kind of good for you, on average going to live longer than your parents. If people on average live twice as long, the same number of people results in twice as many people at any one time in the planet. That's why we're going to get to 10, maybe 10.5 billion. That comes to an end in the current UN projections in the year 2084. It was 2086. We're going to hit peak human for the first time in the history of our species ever. Okay, so really interesting things going on. Children alive today are going to be part of the largest generation to have ever been alive, and then it goes down. Those are the projections. It need not happen. Absolute catastrophe, global disorder, World War III without nuclear. There's loads of scenarios you can think of where the population goes out of control, but in general, we're looking at, if you look at the little red dot, it's moving that way. The number of people going up is less and less in the future. I can show you this one more time, and I'm going to lose your attention soon with these graphs. Exactly the same graph, just using a log scale. Only 3 large events in terms of world population trends. 3 large events worth worrying about. First is shortly after 1492, when a load of us, or in fact not many of us, a small number of us turned up on the 3 ships in the Americas with our germs. And that had a devastating effect on the Americas, but not devastating enough to actually probably reduce global population. And then your second kink is around about the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. That's a very British kink. Other countries were involved, but we were number 1 in that. It's what happens if you invade uninvited 90% of the current members of the United Nations with your civilization. At first, there is lots of death and destruction, and then you get a baby boom after it. The last curve, the current one, is by choice. This is conceptions. This is people being able to control conception, being able to choose abortion, women having actual power to tell men they don't want to have the extra child. And it links to what I'm going to be talking about later, because we are already having fewer and fewer and fewer children. Children are more and more precious. We are the generation who are going to have fewer young people to look after us as we get old, and that has never happened before. So you might think we would be a little bit worried about how we're treating them, because they're not a huge, ever-expanding resource where they're just going to be there when we're in our 60s and our 70s, and if you're lucky in your 80s, and if you're very, very lucky in your 90s. There's going to be less of them. And they are going to choose what they want to do, because they will be aged 30 or 40 or 50 by then. And we'll either be dead or very old. So you'd have thought we would be treating them carefully. I tend to write what my friend who works for the Times newspaper calls rather sulky books about inequality. I started looking at inequality in the late 1980s. I had the 71 census and the 81 census, 91 census, lots of other data. I monitored lots of social statistics during the New Labour years. I was one of the small number of people saying this isn't going terribly well in 98, 99 as they stuck to Conservative spending plans. And when Gordon Brown claimed he was going to take or had taken 1 million children out of poverty, I was one of the annoying people saying they're not going to notice. You've taken them out by so little that it doesn't actually alter their lives. This used to be difficult to do. It was hard in the late 90s and hard in the first decade of the century to say that things were going wrong. It's now, sadly, much, much easier to do. In fact, we're going to have time for questions, don't worry. And I will be really sympathetic, and everybody else has got to be sympathetic, if anybody in this room is willing to tell me about all the things that are going brilliantly well in Britain at the moment. Yeah, and I do. I mean, my life has changed over what I do, from having to argue that it wasn't great what we were doing to worrying about the mental health of audiences and not wanting to depress people too much. You know, which is ironic. Summary of what happened. I like generalizations. I like saying it isn't actually all very complicated. This really, really annoys many of my academic colleagues, but they haven't yet convinced me it is all very complicated. This is a very simple graph. This is the graph of income inequality over a century. The top line is the take of the 1% of the 1%. The next line is the 1 in 1,000. The next line is 1%. The one beneath that is the 10%. They all got the same curve. It's a V-shaped curve. The 1% of the 1% are the people with the highest incomes. The highest 1 in 10,000 people. Way back in 1910, these were the aristocrats. These were the people who had the country houses full of servants. They had an average income of 400 times the average. You need an income of 400 times the average if you're going to have 100 servants, because you need the money to pay your servants, even though you pay them obviously less than the average. That came plummeting down in the UK from around about the time of the First World War throughout the magnificent 1920s that we never saw as magnificent, where there were more strikes than at any time in British history. Unbelievable number of strikes, not just a general strike, recorded by government. Came down during the 1930s when there was mass unemployment, but the wages at the top weren't going down and the country houses were losing their wealth and status, partly because they were losing their overseas possessions, which is how they financed themselves. Came down during the 1940s with a government committed to a new way of living, came down in the 50s, came down in the 60s, right down until the late 1970s. Right, so this country was unbelievably unequal, and you get a similar pattern in much of the rest of Europe, and a similar pattern in the USA, except it starts later after the Second World War. But then we did something which nowhere else in Europe did. Inequality did rise in most countries of Europe, but in many only a little bit. But we went full rebound. We went, hey, you know, how quickly can we get back to 1930s levels of inequality between people who wear top hats and people who wear bowler hats and people who wear flat caps and know your place? It was, in hindsight, quite remarkable. It's a European record. Nowhere else has done this in Europe. We are now, give or take Bulgaria, the economically most unequal country on the continent. When I was a child, we were the second most equal country, large country in Europe. By income inequality, the only country that beat us was Sweden. And that was at Sweden's greatest point of equality. Yeah. So I grew up in a Nordic, equitable state. I went to the nearest school because that's what more and more people were doing. I didn't have to take an 11 plus because my county had got rid of it, as almost all of them did. I was a teenager at the end of full employment where people told their boss where to shove it if they didn't like it and went and got another job. I grew up in a town where the average working man, still men, was paid better than has ever been paid before. Roughly half what the 1% were paid. And at the top of the 1% were not bankers, that was a hospital doctor, because somebody's got to be in the 1%, so who do you put in the 1%? Late 1970s, Callaghan, if anybody wants to argue about it, we can exactly, but Mrs. T and her people, dropping the income taxes for the very rich, changing the nature of society, winning the battle over the souls of people, getting you to think about shirkers and layabouts, and that you had to reward the tall poppies, because if you didn't reward people who made money, who was going to make money for your country and how was it going to trickle down? Through to the 1990s, there was a nice bloke called John Major. That's the only time it stopped slightly. Labour get in 1997, after 18 years of Conservative rule, and stick for the first 2 years to Conservative spending plans, just in case none of you had noticed that it wasn't going to be any different. They deliberately said they would do that and did that. They did bring in a minimum wage. They did give Scotland independence and Wales slightly less. They did change a lot of windows in council houses very quietly without telling anybody about it because they were a bit ashamed. But as I'll show you later, the inequality graph didn't alter one iota in 97, 98, 99, 2000, when we're no longer in Conservative spending plan territory, 2001, 2, 3, 4. Nothing in the data. At the end of that, we're in a kind of wobble. And now it's really interesting. Peak income inequality may have been 2018. There's good news. There is good news. But first, more bad news. Quite a lot of bad news for you. This is my favourite graph. If you're going to pay attention to any graph, of course I've got favourite graphs. You know, you've worked out what strange boy I was at school. It's my favourite one. I like it because the data's from the international radical left-wing organisation called the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund collect information from governments about how much money they're spending in great detail on public services and their GDP. And they also, I'm amazed that journalists don't use this, every government actually tells the IMF what its plans are for 5 years in the future. So you don't have to listen to the speeches. You can just go and look at the IMF data. That's why it goes forward. So this is public spending as a proportion of GDP over time, and we're the big red thick line that's at the bottom. Let me try if I can do this slightly as you're... Right, there's this place called Belgium, okay? It's a like obscure little country in the middle of Europe. It's up there. It taxes people like nothing. It's a wasteland. They're all in the streets dying of starvation. It doesn't work. Then there's this terrible place called France. Like, unbelievable. Nobody has a good life in France. The schools don't work. The hospitals don't work. Housing's shit. Finland, basket case. You wouldn't believe tens of thousands of homeless people in Finland. It's terrible. When you get this, you know, they're all topping themselves and so on. Yes, Finland in the past had an issue with suicide, not anymore. Norway, Denmark, Austria, Sweden, Greece, Italy, Germany. If you want a sensible comparison, right? Don't. If you're at the bottom of the table, don't think, oh, we could be Finland. I mean, it's nice to think that, but think Germany. Okay, Germany is pragmatic. Germany was lucky in a way. Germany was more divided than we were. Partly because somebody built a wall in it, right? And that's what it takes to create the kind of the divides in life expectancy and income of the level that we used to have. Except then somebody knocked the wall down and some folk in Germany decided that they didn't like how it was. And so I could show you graphs that show that inequality in Germany is now indistinguishable from most other European countries. Can you imagine that? Going from that situation. It doesn't mean you still don't get Alternative for Deutschland doing well in the East occasionally, but that happened. This is like a national health service and a half difference. If you want to know why Germany had 4 times more incubators when the pandemic hit than we did, that's it. That's it. If you want to know why Germany has hardly any private schools and people send their children to state schools routinely, almost everybody, as they do in France and Spain and Italy and all of bloody Europe apart from us, because they fund the state schools. Right? If you want to know why do the trains work, right? It's not perfect. And you go to each of these countries. If I go to Norway and say, you're doing really well on this, they go, it's terrible. You wouldn't believe the child poverty that we tolerate, which is why they have very low child poverty. Anyway, you come down to us. It's rising over time. It's rising because the population's getting older and people are not willing to put up with what would happen if we didn't actually increase public spending. Public spending also, by the way, includes military. So the sad thing for us is because our military spending is high, the real level is actually lower. It zooms up when you have a banking crisis, because you bail out the banks with money. It zooms up when you have a pandemic. That's those. We were beating 2 countries in the past, and those 2 countries were Spain, shortly after Franco had been in charge, and Greece shortly after the junta. So essentially it's non-democratic European countries. We, of course, are the mother of all democracies. We have this wonderful thing called the House of Lords, where we pick people on merit to rule us. We have an incredible electoral system called first past the post, which, you know, no other country has discovered this wonderful way to elect people, where 34% of the electorate can elect 64% of MPs. 400 poor souls, most who are never going to be in a government, maybe the worst ever Labour government we ever have. Being sensible about this. When people tell you that there is no alternative and there's some very strict fiscal rules and you can't possibly do things, they're not geographers. They don't know there's this place called Europe. Right? It's not very far away, right? Or they're looking at a place called United States. And that before Trump, which was worse than us. Why am I getting cocky? I know I shouldn't get cocky, it's not endearing, but it gets hard. Because I'm not telling you anything that anybody else doesn't tell you anymore. This is Stephanie Flanders and John Byrne Murdoch, Bloomberg and the Financial Times. About 2 or 3 years ago, when I started work on the 7 Children book, before I started, pointing out these shock horror statistics that the poorest fifth of people in the UK are poorer than the average poorest fifth in Europe. I heard this morning at a public talk by the River Thames that our median income is now going to look lower than the median income in Slovakia. Slovakia, by the way, is a particularly successful East European country, but still we are peripheral. UK is a peripheral, poor country with a few rich people that has been sinking very fast. And my last slide before I actually get on to the book you came to hear about is kind of the strangeness of Britain. This is an artwork printed on silk of the length of the forms you have to fill in to receive basic universal credit, just how many questions there are and so on. So very unusual country at a very unusual time. Now, imagine my problem, okay? I'm somebody who writes books and papers with graphs in about what's happening, and things carry on getting worse and worse and worse, but only some people buy books with graphs in, right? So I tried with Shattered Nation of doing a book with no graphs in it, which helps a little bit, but only some people buy non-fiction books. What most people buy are fiction books, because what they want is stories and to be entertained. And so what I tried with 7 Children is to tell a story of 7 typical children. And I'll explain to you why 7 and some of what I did. And this was difficult because I'm not a fiction writer. And in hindsight, I maybe should have tried to do it with a fiction writer. Fiction is much harder than non-fiction. Non-fiction is really easy, as far as I'm concerned. There is just one truth. It isn't multiple, it's not very complicated. People try and make it because we have thousands of academics, and you kind of, somebody might ask, why do we need so many tens of thousands of you? And you go, oh, it's all very complicated. But there is only one truth. You write a sentence, it either is true or not. You write a paragraph, it's either true or not. You can make a mistake, that's a mistake, or you can get it right. You put a source, you check your source, you decide what order in which to present things. You've got some leeway, but there is a story. You've got some judgment about the most important things that need to be told. You can become more expert at things over time in that you see something and go, actually, that can't be true. I'm not going to quote that. I'm going to double check it. But it is a relatively easy thing to do, but it is not that much fun reading non-fiction books. Fiction, stories, people actually choose to read them for pleasure. Right, so we've got this country, which is the most unequal in Europe, where living standards for most people have been falling, and is there a way of telling the story of it? There is a geeky maths answer to why 7. Because of Peter Townsend, whose memorial was held in this building, Professor of Sociology, and others, but mainly Peter, since the 1990s, we've had detailed statistics on child poverty and inequality being produced by the government. A survey done very well in the past, recent governments have cut the size of it, that looks at all the expenses of families, looks through their bank accounts, You don't just ask somebody their income. You get the bank statements and have a look and check it, and looks at what happens to the children in general, and asks a series of questions, including simple everyday ones, such as, did you have a holiday last year? Let's just try this with you. A holiday, so think of last year, 2024. A holiday is a week spent away from home, not staying with family and friends. Doesn't matter if you don't think of it as a holiday. If you went away from home for a week and you weren't staying with family and friends, that's a holiday. So who had a holiday last year? Okay, I'm not going to do the reverse, right? But that's the majority of you. Okay. For children, it's about 60% now. 40% of children no longer have a holiday. And those are the kind of things we know from households below average income statistics from the Family Resources Survey that's been asked every year. We also know how many parents say they no longer need a holiday, their children don't need one, it's been so long since they have one. You know, why would you do that? The bars on the front of the book are proportional to the disposable income of the 7 children, with an error, which is bar number 8, which the publisher thought it looked much better with 8 bars than 7. And I, despite my tact and how much I love graphs, couldn't persuade them, please can we just have 7 bars. So bar number 8, which goes off the scale, is dedicated to Boris Johnson and his family. Irrespective of how many children he actually has, he will still be up there. Disposable income is your income after you've paid your taxes, after you've received any benefits in a year, less the amount of money you pay to be housed, less your mortgage or rent, right? So that's your disposable income. It makes no sense looking at it before housing, particularly for children, because you don't have a choice if you have a child. You can't sleep on the streets with a child. It's not allowed, right? Social services will come and get you. The police will stop you. So you've got to be housed. Housing costs have got to be paid. This is the money that people have after they pay for their housing. It's the money that you need for food, for heating, to pay the phone bill, to buy the phone, for soap, for bus tickets, everything. If you've got good eyesight, you can see there's 100 little grey bars there, and the 7 children are the coloured bars taken out, and the pie chart does the same for the 7 children. The poorest child has a disposable income, or her mother does, of £118 a week. She's working, mum. She works in a care home. Child's called Anna. The children were born in the autumn of 2018. Why 7? Because households below average income reports in great detail for what are called quintiles, for fifths of the population. And amongst the poorest fifth of the population of the UK live 28% of our children. 28% is twice 14%. 14%, give or take some decimal points, is a seventh. Right, so 2/7 of our children live in the poorest fifth of households, because households with children are more likely to be poor. And in the next fifth of the population, again, it's 28% of children. So the next 2/7 of children live in the next poorest fifth. And then it's near enough 14%, 14%, 14%. So if you're trying to talk about the distribution of children across the income scale, and it's income which determines things above all else, it is how much money your parents have which determines whether you get to spend a week in a caravan or a tent or a B&B or fly to Spain or fly to Tuscany. It's income. It's income which correlates to your height, it's income that correlates to your health, it's income which determines your exam results, far more than any effort you ever put in yourselves. It's income that matters. And fortunately for me, because of these 28% that I saw on the table, I went, okay, I can have 7 children, I know that my poorest 2 come from the poorest 5th. If you do it out by 100, then you're going to have 7% of children that you're going to ignore. Then you take the poorest child, 14 points again, next child, evenly spaced. We'll put it another way. When these children were born, there were 14 million children in the UK. So if you want 7 typical children, you take your 14 million, you order them by income, and you take the poorest 2 million, next 2 million, next 2 million, 7 times 2 is 14, and you take the middle child of each 2 million. So we're going to ignore the poorest million children, who are often talked about. We're ignoring the baby P's. We're ignoring the little baby who died in Skegness next to his father who'd had the heart attack. We're ignoring the children whose parents go to food banks. We're ignoring most, but not all, of the children whose parents are in prison. We're ignoring the standard stories. We're ignoring the 100,000 children in B&B accommodation with their parents. But we're ignoring the bottom million. This isn't about destitution. It's not about the worst of children. And we're also ignoring the best of million. Now, the problem with ignoring the best of million is that the families of the best of million are actually taking half of that pie chart. Right? The best off of us take, the best off 10th are taking 40% of all income. Now, you can look at that chart and you can see that child 1, 2, and 3 are living in families with the same disposable income as child 7. So, and I hate doing this because it kind of spoils the surprise in the book, but you've come here, so you deserve to know about it. Child 1, Anna, single mum, dad's not nearby, part-time worker in a care home. Child 2, Brandon, family 1 benefits. Child 3, Candice, they're working. They receive an eviction letter towards the end. Between 2 and 3 of these children are in private rented. That is, they've only got 8 weeks of security of tenure, which is shocking. Never happened when I was a child. When I was a child, almost all children in Britain lived in houses that they couldn't be evicted from in 2 months. So what about our rich child 7? She's called Gemma. You'll notice I like to sing simple. They go A, B, C, D, E, F. Gemma's parents, I could have made them secondary school teachers, but I didn't. I made them, they're running a corner shop. Their disposable income, after paying tax and benefits, and after the cost of housing, which is very low because they've almost paid their mortgage off on a little flat above the corner shop, they're each getting 25,000 a year. That's 50 grand. 50 grand, £50,000 income makes you child number 7. You're the rich kid. Right? And I haven't made a mistake with the data. Right? The people who get to write books, the people who get to be university lecturers, most of the people who can come to talks like this, the people who can afford to buy a cup of coffee that costs £3 or £4 or £5 and don't have to worry about it, the people who can actually afford to buy a book are the parents of the best off million children. There is more inequality within the best of million. If you look at the grey bars, the last 2 are cut off. The 1%, the average income is 621,000 a year. Meaningless figure. Except our friend Boris, luckily that's what he normally earns when he's not Prime Minister. When he's Prime Minister, he can't even afford wallpaper. And if I won't go into sympathy for the rich, but it's important to understand that the biggest inequalities in Britain are amongst the very rich. But child number 7, mum and dad run a corner shop. Well, efficiently. Their worries are about education. They've got 2 daughters. They've got just enough money that they could send Gemma to a private school. But then they'll have nothing left for anything else. And they couldn't send both girls to a private school. And that's their kind of angst. They've all got worries. Every single family in this book have got worries. Their worries are all incredibly serious to them. Their worries are about, can they afford to buy crayons for the kid? Will they be able to get enough food? Their worries are about, are they filling in those universal credit forms correctly so they're not going to get sanctioned? so people aren't going to get hungry. Their worries are that a letter lands on their mat and they got an eviction notice. Their worries are how they're going to pay for a school trip. Their worries are very, very much day by day. They tend less to be great worries about the future, but when you get up to the heady heights of two people running a corner shop, doing it well, making a little bit of cash, their worry is, what can they do for their daughters so their daughters don't have to spend their lives running a corner shop? And what might define the future for their daughters will be to send them to a school where they're guaranteed to get A's and B's and they can get into a good university, and I don't know, they could be a dentist or a lawyer or something and head off into the heady lands of the 10%, the group I'm well up in, the group who have 2 or 3 holidays a year, where the question is, where are the cheap flights to? Have you managed to renew your annual travel insurance? I have a lot in the book about home insurance. I have a lot about which families can afford to save £10 a month or not, and who is paying for insurance against fire or theft or flood. Some of it can be like boring detail. It's done as dialogue and fiction to try to make it more interesting. When you are, or have become again, as a country as unequal as we are, when the gaps are this big between people, trying to explain what the actual decisions are is difficult. We know this because we've been here before, right? There were people writing books in the 1920s and 30s trying to explain what's going on. There were earlier books. The Seven Children begins talking about a book called Around a Pound a Week, which I think was published around 1914 by Maud Pember Reeves, about the incomes of the respectable working class in Lambeth. And in the way Anna's family are respectable working class, you know, we're ignoring the poorest million children. Mum's got a job. If you take £1 a week back then, around about 1914, and apply the Bank of England inflation rate to it, just by chance, you get £118 a day. So the poorest of the 7 children, materially, nothing has altered in a century. Yes, Mum has got an iPhone, because she has to have one to work, or it's probably an Android, to be honest. Could be a second-hand, could be a nicked iPhone, but it's mundane. How did this happen? How did we get to this? The graph that's near to me shows you the huge increase in inequality when it occurred in the 1980s, and then the flatlining since 1997. Right? It's a remarkable feat to take 1 million children out of poverty and not move that curve. Right? You've got to take families just beneath the poverty level and move them just up for our level of inequality to remain so incredibly high. The other lines are various cost of living crises, the most recent ones. The current cost of living crisis we're in, which began in 2008, and which we almost got out of before the pandemic and inflation again. The current one is the second longest running in history. And we have the longest time series in the world. So there was a worse cost of living crisis in British history. It lasted from 1798 to 1822 before wages got back to the level at 1798. It's around about the time we kind of became the modern country we are. But these are remarkable things. The graphs nearer to me are to do with heights. There's lots of arguments about heights. We're currently trying to get an article in the British Medical Journal about heights of children. But the only statistics out there are that our children have been getting shorter. We absolutely know that the infant mortality rate and the child mortality rate has been rising. Last year higher than the year before, higher than the year before, higher than the year before. Nothing to do with the pandemic. Maternal mortality is rising, and the principal reason that more women who are pregnant are dying is suicides. Right? It gets very depressing. The same in the United States. Increasing number of suicides amongst pregnant mothers. And let's cheer you up for a second. Right? So this graph is the latest United Nations statistics on child poverty changing over 7 years. All those blue bars at the bottom are countries with decreases in child poverty. In most of the world, most of the time, most things are getting better. Sometimes unbelievably, incredibly better. Even the child poverty statistics, I won't read out the European countries. These are countries rich enough that they can produce statistics that the United Nations can report. But look at those falls. In some cases, they're 30, 25% falls in just 7 years. They include places like Korea, incredibly unequal country. They actually even include the United States, which had a small fall. And then there are only a few countries which had an absolute rise in child poverty. And at the very top, that red bar, is the United Kingdom. Now, somebody has to be the worst country on that graph, right? The only way you get to stand up here and go, the most unequal country, give or take Bulgaria, is if you do that, right? It's an appalling situation and an appalling record. It's not me fiddling the figures or cherry picking. That is just what's happened. It does mean, if you're optimistic, it's going to be really hard for us to stay up there like that. I mean, you push yourself that high, odds on, just randomness. It would take a really, really callous government to manage to keep child poverty at one of the highest rates in Europe and rising. I mean, what we do, go for a one-child policy after the current two-child policy that the Labour government are still in favour of? It becomes harder and harder to actually do this. It doesn't cost much money. In Scotland, they've introduced a Scottish child payment to largely eradicate the rises in child poverty. The only parliamentary constituencies in the country that report falls in child poverty are all in Scotland. What magic thing do they do in Scotland? For 2 out of 7 children, very fortunate for me because I can calculate for 7 children, for 2 out of 7 children, which in this case would actually be Anna and Brandon, they're given, at the time these children were aged about 5, £25 a week, not tapered, which means not reduced if you receive other benefits. Simply, the families, almost always the mother, are given £25 a week to ensure that they don't go hungry and they don't go cold. 56% of children with a brother and sister in this country go seriously hungry about 3 times a month. That statistic comes from the MP from Swansea, Torsten Bell, when he was head of the Resolution Foundation. Right. Currently a member of the government in a tricky situation. Peter Townsend, who I've mentioned before, just because I'm here, helped produce the Black Report in 1977 and actually had a list of 10 areas with the worst health in Britain that he said government must intervene in. And it's an interesting experiment because, of course, the government that came in 1979 was going to have nothing to do with this. So it didn't intervene. 5 of the 10 areas got better just by chance, because if you pick the bottom 10, it's really hard for them all to stay there. I mean, more positively, every trade union deal has been progressive that's published. Since 2018-19, the highest pay awards are for people at the bottom, often almost zero for people at the top. This didn't happen until 2018-19. We're seeing a whole load of changes. We did increase benefits by inflation during the pandemic and still afterwards. So there are signs of things potentially changing. But it's like 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921 in terms of the trends again. Elections. And I'm only 4 slides away from the end. You'll be very glad to know. Simple ways of looking at elections. Right? Elections produce an enormous number of statistics. And why am I looking at elections? Because it's partly, well, the idea is, what can you do about this? Although it's slightly problematic when the party that's supposed to sort it out turns out not to give a damn. This is the election of 2019, when Labour lost. What I've done is take the 66 million people in the UK, divided them up by age group. which goes down, put them into blocks of 1 million, and then worked out to the nearest million how many people voted which party. Makes it much simpler. I think it's not until age 43 that you start getting your first solid block of Tory voters, right? So it was the old voting for the Conservative Party. Labour quite spread out, but slightly more support amongst the young. I had to make arbitrary decisions about where to put the minor parties, but to be honest, in the first past the post, they don't really matter very much. And I put children in just to say, remember they don't get to vote, even though this affects them all. Here's 2014. As you can see, I'm slightly pedantic. The age groups altered somewhat. The population went up. We've had lots of immigration. That's what happens if you do Brexit. You get more people. But anyway. Labour vote really, really spread out now, right across the age range, interestingly. It went down amongst the young. You remember fewer people voted Labour in 2024? Yeah. I don't know, that terrible man with a beard. Oh, no, he's gone. Sorry. Anyway, the light blues reform. The light blues reform coming in. That's the interesting, almost unpredictable thing that they'd actually do that well. If you wonder why Sunak called the election as early as he did, well, what would have happened if he'd waited 2 months or 3 months or 4 months? By the time Reform had actually got credible candidates into, credible means not paedophiles, credible candidates into every constituency, not put forward candidates who are going to later take them to court and so on. Reform did incredibly well, despite Sunak wrong footing and going earlier. They're sitting on 25% now of the electorate. I'm such a softie that I do really worry about using the word parasites and billionaires, because billionaires have got feelings too. But I don't know. That's a poster that appears on the tube. One more slide to go, so please think of questions. Those graphs all tilt downwards, almost all tilt downwards. Inequality is falling in most countries in Europe most of the time. Child health is getting better, education is getting better, the position of women is improving almost everywhere, apart from the 2% of the world's population who are women who live in the United States. But that's 2%. Right, don't get transfixed by the bad news of particular places. In most of the world, most of the time, most things are getting better. Inequalities across the world have been falling, primarily because of China, but within most countries they're falling. There are an out-of-control set of billionaires, and there is destitution at the bottom, and there is wars and killing, but you can compare these things over time, and it isn't necessarily a terrible story. And that really matters, because the reality of Britain is entirely avoidable. If it was the case that things are falling apart everywhere else, or the inequality in the rest of Europe was slowly rising towards us, and this was the only pragmatic way to go, and you've got to go for economic growth and reward the wealth creators. If that was the story, but it isn't. Right? Those countries that are much more equal than us, that have much less child poverty, that have much better educational results, whose children can speak multiple languages and they actually do maths properly. And like our children who've got an A star or an A but can't actually do it, but they can get an A star or an A, right? There are alternatives, of which Scotland is the most interesting to us, given it's inside the UK, but we're on the edge of this continent that has the most alternatives on the planet for affluent countries. And it's not very far away. You could probably predict my politics, but this relates to children. You may not know that over a century ago, there were a whole series of socialist Sunday schools. These were somewhat different to the Sunday school I went to, where I had to colour in Jesus, for some reason blue. I never know why I was told to colour in. I could give him a pink face. Yeah, anyway, that's the kind of Sunday school I went to. I would be the kind of precocious child who would wish I had gone to a Sunday school where I was taught the alternative 10 commandments that don't look that radical. The banner there is the banner of the East Bradford Socialist Sunday School, put together in the early months of 1914, before the First World War, with poppies on it, just by chance. It was a symbol of hope from renewal, from the soil, with the rising sun, which is a typical kind of symbol of hope and fruit and happiness and goodness for all. we've been bumbling around with the same kind of solutions for a couple of 100 years. There are good people who get them enacted in many places. In general, we get progress. In general, we don't treat children as badly as we did in the past. In many ways, much, much better than we did in the past, except for in this country in recent years, and it's intolerable, it's avoidable, and it has to stop. A statistic I learned yesterday, which I'll end on, because there were always things that shocked me. There is currently a law being put through the legislature in Florida under the Trump administration in general to make it legal to employ children, 16-year-olds I think, to work for 8 hours from 11:30 at night through to 6:30, 7, without a break, employed, child labour to be made legal again in the United States at night before they go to school. Right? Things really can go backwards. It's possible. If you want something to fear, it's that this current government makes such a shambles of what they're doing that the population vote, in effect, for that without realising what it is that they're voting for. That's our worry. The alternative is that our government and us realise that this is appalling. We also realise that all those stupid fiscal rules are stupid. Again, I learned this morning that we've changed the fiscal rules 10 times since they were apparently invented and said they couldn't be altered. That what's happened internationally in the last couple of weeks blows out of the water all your supposed careful economic plans anyway, which were bollocks. And that we're very lucky to live in a country in which there was a party brave enough to say that it wouldn't tolerate child poverty and has actually shown how to do that. And the households below average income statistics, which came out at the end of March, just 2 weeks ago, showed the one place in the UK where child poverty falling is Scotland. So it's not rocket science. You simply do what they've done in Scotland and you say thank you to the Scots. Can you imagine how hard that would be for government ministers to do? Just say thank you. We're going to do it now. Right? That's all they've got to do to begin to change it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Then just put your hand up and I'll let you know what I'm choosing with. And we've got a microphone. This is just so that people at home can hear your questions so that they know what Danny's responding to. So, hands up if you've got a question. Oh, and if I seem to be puzzling with questions, it's just because I'm asking why you've never heard. Not just for questions. Any questions?
Go on, be brave.
Go on. The first one's always the hardest. Oh yes, so we have person in the middle.
Yeah, I can. No, I hate
It's still got people on screen.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've lived in London 35 years and I bring up statistics like anything else. I've done it for 35 years. And there's something about living in London that makes you absolutely inoculated from this. I've come from Sheffield and I've thought over and over, I've got to go back and live in Sheffield.
Yeah.
Because there's sort of an understanding there. Without having to read books or anything, you know, there's an understanding. I've got brothers and sisters who are on benefit. You know, you're torn all the time if you could live in London. Well, except you're not.
Yeah.
Most people think it's the best place in the world to be. But what the question is ethnicity. London is based on massive immigration and student numbers. And whenever I've looked at statistics like this on inequality, ethnicity is always the big variable. Because white working class is not an ethnicity, it's never included. They compare black and white, or Asian, black, white. And amongst white, there's a lot of poor people. The majority actually, because it's that population is largest. But it's all got shifted. over to ethnicity. And I wondered if you thought about that when you were doing your work. You
Thank
never
you.
bring that in at all.
No.
About recent immigrants or asylum seekers, whatever. They tend to be the poorest.
Yeah.
And the countries that have immigrated more people probably have more poor people. And
Yeah.
I think that messes it all up, really, if you want to talk about
Yeah.
the general. You talk about the general population all the time.
Yes.
You never break it down, do you?
Okay, no, you're right. I mean, to start with the beginning, it's really interesting to say about coming from North and coming here, because I often hear from people who've come from other countries and fairly recently and say, can't quite believe it. And often, if they've got the chance, they go back to where they come from. But the UK is exciting for some people, so we get this migration to London because it's not like a boring Scandinavian country where everything is sorted out and ordered, but you might have to pay a fair amount of tax. Here you can make your fortune as Dick Whittington. And that's worked for centuries. London's always only survived on immigration. It's never produced enough children to repeat itself. None of the children have an obvious ethnicity or race. I do have detailed, there's 100 pages of detailed stats at the back in notes. So I have the figures broken down by ethnicity, and the majority of the poorest seventh are white, but amongst that poorest seventh, it has the largest chance of not being white. Anna was originally going to be called a Joa. Publisher didn't want it. It was really interesting. I had 2 readers for sensitivity. It's partly fortunate because I can't actually pronounce a Joa correctly. It's like Adawa, but it's a Ghanaian name. But even then, I just said her mother heard it once at school and thought it sounded nice. But I've deliberately not done race and religion in there and make it difficult to see. So you might assume that Gemma's family are not, her parents are not originally from Britain simply when you heard corner shop. Okay, but that's your assumption. So one of the games I play in the book is I hide where they are geographically, but you can find it. Did you say you're from Sheffield? Okay. It's interesting. I lived in Sheffield. I lived in Sheffield for 10 years. If it wasn't for migration, we would be in all kinds of trouble. Let me take Sheffield rather than London. So Sheffield, when I was there, this is 14, 15, 16 years ago, had 60,000 overseas students. Now, in a population of 500,000, Sheffield's the 5th biggest city. The 60,000 overseas students were the reason we could stop blowing up the tower blocks. My oldest child, one of his first words were tower block was bang. Because I used to take him to see the tower blocks being blown up and terrace streets being demolished. But 60,000 overseas students saved Sheffield. And a lot of immigration, but only to certain parts of Darnell and certain parts of Sheffield, and not others. So it's different from Liverpool. There's the 2 contrasting cities where Liverpool and Glasgow lost population, had to demolish and got smaller. Sheffield quietly managed to stay at 500,000. I don't think it's the most important thing, although it's extremely useful for politicians who don't want you to think about inequality. So the main reason why you can't get a home or a house or a flat that's big enough isn't because we haven't built enough. London has never had as many empty bedrooms as it has now. It's that more people than ever own 2 properties in London, and one of them is not being used, or the maisonettes that were built for a family, mum and dad and 2 kids, are now occupied by a single young professional renting off a private landlord. The reason why you can't necessarily get your child into a good school isn't because we don't have enough schools. We have more schools per head than anywhere else in Europe. We've got more teachers because the 7% of kids going private have an awful lot of teachers and buildings and lawns, right? It's because of how we share it out, and we share it out most inefficiently. Similarly with our hospitals, 10% of people go private. We have this booming private health service. But instead of saying, this is why you can't get a house, this is why you can't get healthcare, this is why you can't get education, if you believe that inequality is good, which is the essential mantra of the Conservative Party, inequality is good, let the tall poppies grow tall, let the wealth creators create wealth, and it will shower down upon you like a trickle of pea. Right, that is what the Conservative Party is about. You don't tell the great unwashed and the lower orders that you basically are just thick, and it's only because of us that you're okay. You tell them the reason you can't get a house and you can't get this is those immigrants who've turned up to take it away from you. We've been doing that since at least 1905. And it's effective. I mean, it really isn't, it's amazing how it still works, particularly in London, which is the most cosmopolitan city in Europe, that you can still dog whistle, despite the fact that hardly anybody here can look back 4 or 5 generations and go, you know, my great-great-granny lived in London. Well, quite unlikely she actually did, or probably isn't actually a great-great-great-granny. But anyway, racism and immigration are traditionally used to defend inequality. Even and remarkably, most of all in places that nobody goes to. So the fewer people who migrate to an area, on average, the greater the fear of immigrants is, and it's measured. I can go on and on about this. So I live in the city I was born in, which is one of the most affected by immigrants ever. If I was doing this talk in Oxford, I'll get you to put your hands up if you're born in the city, and maybe one of you would, and then we'd realise we knew each other, right? Because my city has been socially cleansed by immigrants. Almost all of them English, white and posh, who come to the university and decide they want to hang around for a bit, right? So hardly anybody, tiny minority who went to school with me, can live in the city anymore. It's not the end of the world. I don't like it. I do think we should arrange things so that it should be possible not to have a city that becomes a hotel of constant turnover of immigrants. But yeah, if I can tolerate immigrants in the city of the greatest number of immigrants, where the immigrants happen to be posh and white, you know, we can all tolerate people whose lives haven't been as privileged as the people who've turned up in my city, including, you know, myself coming back to help gentrify the last ungentrified street in Oxford.
We have a comment here, rather than a question from Congress. Thank you, Rhonda, for contributing. Heeley was saying that policies of Margaret Thatcher were catastrophic in this country. She did something to the industrial heartlands and ripped out the social fabric of this country, both north and south. My family came from the north, I can certainly say their side. And then there's a question from C. Lurker here, and said, this is not a question directly related to the topic of the talk, but as a person who works with data and presents data, and who, as you said, believe that there is a database truth, how do you deal with people who simply deny the data? Maybe they say the data can be manipulated to the extremist left wing, or is this a huge, this is a huge challenge facing science and database communications these days. What do you do about that?
Okay, on those two, one interesting thing about Margaret Thatcher is in 1986 she signed up to a World Health Organization target to reduce inequalities in health between areas and between social classes. So she did at least actually think that what she was doing was going to make things better. Whereas the current set of Conservatives, I honestly don't think they have the morals of Margaret Thatcher. And her morals were not very moral, but at least she did think that trickle down was going to benefit the poor more because they had lowest life expectancy. So she thought that their life expectancy would rise more, the rich wouldn't rise as much because they're already living longest. And in fact, we got the opposite occurred. But it's changed. how do you deal with people who don't believe you? Or the funniest one is when people from the Spectator try and make their own graphs. I shouldn't be mean. It's great they do and try and use data. Kind of Dominic Cummings, because they think they're absolute geniuses, because they spent 3 years at Oxford as a teenager. Anyway, sorry, smug, but you get that lot. You get, and it's stopped a bit recently, right? Because things are so bad, you don't get the Spectator trying to produce graphs showing that everything's got better. There's a stage when they tried to show that inequality was narrowing by using the quintile ratio, so the richest fifth and the worst off fifth, and the medium, the middle person, because it was getting smaller. That ignores the top 10%, that's 40% of all income, and the bottom 10%. Anyway, what I do with real skeptics is I ask them for their data. And my favourite was a man, I think still around, was actually absolutely convinced that climate change was a hoax. He was completely convinced. I replied to emails, we shouldn't say that publicly, and I asked him for the data, and he sent me the data in the end, which was satellite estimates of temperatures around the world. And then I drew a graph of his data for him, and it was quite random, but temperature was going up. And I sent it to him, I said, the data you've sent to me telling me the world isn't warming tells me the world's warming. And then he went quiet. But if you do science, part of it is always thinking you might have made a mistake. And the mistakes are the really interesting things. You know, if it turned out the world wasn't warming and little Danny in Oxford was the one who found out it wasn't, that's a Nobel Peace Prize and good news. Unfortunately, it's not the case. The mistakes are interesting. I'll give you one example of a mistake or one. We used to produce lots of atlases, and I was looking at stepchildren, and the lowest number of stepchildren in the country was in Hull, and the highest number was in the Cotswolds. And I thought we'd just done a thing which we can do sometimes where you flip the data. You just got it completely wrong and you're about to publish it. But it turns out that Hull does have the lowest number of stepchildren, because that's a really low rate of getting married, and if you don't get married, you can't have stepchildren. The Cotswolds is jam-packed, as much as anywhere in Britain can be, with what were called reconstituted families. So you've got a lovely thatched cottage, mum and dad, 4 kids. It's just that 2 of the kids are his from his first relationship and 2 are hers from her first, but they look like a chocolate box family, but on the census form, where you have to say how you're related, they're not. And that's interesting. So your mistakes teach you things you didn't know. But it's always constantly about worrying. You know, when I pick the UN data that shows that we've had the biggest increase in child poverty, have the United Nations made a mistake? Because the older you get and the longer that you do this, the more responsibility you have not to be able to say, not my problem, it's their data that's wrong. Which is why I worry about the height data. One problem with the height data is during the pandemic, people didn't move around very much. There's more sitting on sofas, people ate more. Kids got much fatter, and part of the reason of eating more junk food is that they got taller for a bit, but that's the pandemic effect. We worry about all of these things.
Everybody had what my friend called a prosecco belly.
Yeah.
On the question,
Could you just add some comments perhaps about how you might think wealth inequality adds to the inequality of wealth, and what the effect over time then is these hypothetical children get older in terms of inheritance to their parents?
Yeah. So most of that in the book is hidden in the notes at the end. Proper wealth, as meaning the amount of wealth where you pay inheritance tax. I've forgotten what it is. Something like only about 8% of people ever pay inheritance tax. Even in Kensington and Chelsea, it's just 12%. In Hull, by the way, it's 0. Nobody in 1 year. So the main message about wealth is that none of these kids have it, of 7 typical children. Gemma's, they're about to buy the flat, so they own the flat over the corner shop, but that's where mum and dad are going to eke out their days until their 80s probably, and then they'll spend the money before they die. So for 7 typical children spread out across the income scale, the wealth is negligible, although important. Getting like £4 or £5 from a grandparent could make a real difference to their lives, but isn't probably what the majority of us in this room are thinking about as wealth, which is a gift of £40,000 towards a deposit for a house or paying for a master's degree. You know, and of course, you don't just pay the fees for a master's degree, you're paying the rent and the food. The kind of insurance. So wealth inequality really matters, but it's a thing that only the very, very well off actually take part in. But you don't think you're well off. Nobody thinks they're well off. There's a lovely book called Born to Rule by Sam Friedman and Aaron Reeves, where they've interviewed hundreds of people who are in a who's who. And nobody in who's who thinks they're part of the elite. And they don't think they're wealthy, because what we tend to do is to compare ourselves to people we know. And this is a horrible thing about human nature. We tend to know more people slightly better off than us. Now, the only way mathematically that can be true is if we're ignoring people who think that they're our good friends, but they're not quite as well off as we are. And we think we're friends with people who don't actually think they're our friends. But it has an effect of being in this situation. The wealth is concentrating amongst the very top. It'll concentrate particularly if you're the only child, and it'll come down. So we're heading back towards a great Gatsby potential, but it's for a few. It's just for 7 typical children, there is no wealth of any substantial amount when it comes to, for instance, mortgages. And this is interesting, because if you've got a house, if you own a house outright, you know, or you've got a mortgage and you're going to pay it off in 10 years in London, who on earth's going to buy your property? The most likely person is going to be a private landlord, and they won't want to pay that much for it if things carry on as they are, because none of these 7 children are going to be in a position to ever pay for that. But it doesn't work out. It can't carry on. You can't go to a situation of a century ago when 90% of people were in private renting. And I look in the book at people who are landlords of multiple properties and aged under 30 years old, because they've been inherited. You know, and it's just gross. I mean, it really, the idea that you have the power of a god over people's lives. There's certainly scope for wealth taxes and all that, but it's just a tiny, tiny proportion. Take the farmers. I heard that they had their tractors in Oxford the other day, right? The farmers worried about paying inheritance tax because their special farming genes have been passed on to, you know, little Billy the farmer's son. And if Billy doesn't get the farm, nobody else could possibly farm it, or whatever their argument is why they can't. The number of farmers who are going to have to pay inheritance tax is minuscule. But the amount of wealth that there is amongst this very small number of people is absolutely enormous. And we could certainly have some of that. And in the past, as the income inequality was coming down from 1918 to the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, the wealth inequalities were also diminishing dramatically over time. Wealth inequalities took a bit longer to diminish. And going back to Margaret Thatcher, the biggest transfer of wealth to the poor ever in this country's history was actually right to buy, because it was done at a discount. And it was a gift of wealth to the poor. I've always been in favour of right to buy. I just would like right to sell as well. So you keep the stock. You know, if you want to do DIY and look after your own place, that's fine. But right to buy was like the end of wealth inequalities reducing. And the problem was that the families who bought at a discount sold to a private landlord, who then made an absolute fortune out of, you know, 1 in 3 of our children in England are living in a house where a private landlord's in charge. You know, it should be illegal. It's unbelievable. You know, and these private landlords are not experts on how to provide decent, safe property. They're experts about being greedy. And they're only going to make a decent return if they don't fix the property, charge as much rent as they can. They're borrowing from a bank, in most cases, to be able to do this. If I was renting privately in Oxford, my rent would be double the mortgage payments I'm making. It's criminal theft. It's this money going to, what does it pay for? How many cruises can you go on? How many grandchildren can you pay their way through Wellington School or whatever? And what, and I've got some sympathy for really rich people, but what on earth do you need the money for? Out of the poorest people in Britain, making your retirement comfortable from their rents, right? And you just need to say it is unacceptable. You should be ashamed.
We had two people over here asking questions.
What role do grammar schools play in worsening inequality, and are there as many grammar schools in mainland Europe as there are in the UK?
That's a great question. I think we've still got 163 officially, which is relatively small. People often think that the grammar school, as we know, was introduced in the 1942 Act. When it was introduced, it increased equality because of what we were going away from. But grammar schools don't make things better now. Mainland Europe has this incredible patchwork of different systems. So there is a kind of grammar school in Germany, but the technical schools are very good. Norway still has a grammar school system. So Finland, which doesn't, has far better educational outcomes than Norway. And these are two very, very equal countries. You've got to be very careful. So some countries claim they have private schools, but those are selective schools where the state still pays the money. And that's the case in France. But in general, not separating children produces the best educational outcomes. The children who are good at maths are still good at maths, even if they are alongside children who are average. You don't have to put all the nerdy ones together. Separating children does all kinds of damage. I mean, any of you, if you're a little bit my age or a bit older, you may well have been to a grammar school, but you might have a sibling who didn't. It divides families. The children who pass the 11 plus but they just had a good day, and then they're at the bottom of the grammar school, have got to spend their schooling years feeling stupid. The children who just have a bad day and don't pass the test end up going to a secondary modern. This is still the case in Kent and Devon, where you're basically written off from that point at 11. There isn't inherited difference in ability, which was the reason. So Margaret Thatcher, I think, went to a grammar in Keviston near Lincoln. The worst thing that grammars do is make people believe quite often that they are very clever because they've passed the test at 11. You imagine doing this you take a 10-year-old, right? Take a 10-year-old and tell them that you're going to get them to do a test. Don't worry, dear, it doesn't matter very much, right? They're not stupid children. They can tell you're nervous. It doesn't matter very much, but we're going to get this tutor in to help you, right? It doesn't matter very much, and we still love you no matter how well you do, right? And then, oh, darling, you've passed. That's wonderful. You're going to be going to this school. You're 11. And you go to school and you put on a different blazer, and you take a different bus to the other children on your street, and 12 and 13. Now, what do you think? What you think, and what the teachers who decided to work in the grammar school tell you, in effect, maybe implicitly, is, well, children like you who are more academically able need more attention. So when I do school talks, the most vicious views at age 16 I ever hear are in state grammar schools. People who are much more likely to believe that they work harder, they're cleverer, they're better, and if people don't try hard enough, they don't deserve it. Far more vicious views from state grammar schools than from any private school I've taught in. And that's a shock. So just get rid of it, don't go there. It doesn't mean you can't have differences in provision. And, you know, my preference for a small city with 6 state schools would be to allow children to move between the schools, and for one of the schools to have the best science labs in the city, another to specialise in languages. You use the fact you've got 6 sites so that the only people who send their kids private are idiots, right? I'm not into kind of complete uniformity. I was a child who was very good at some things and extremely bad at others. But I'm very, very lucky to have been born in a county that meant I wasn't asked at the age of 11 to take a test, and I couldn't read a single word at age 8. You know, and you might listen to me and think he should never have been allowed. He should never have been allowed to university. Okay, you know, it's just cruel. And the worst thing is making some people who've been to grammar schools, almost always men, think for the rest of their lives that they're superior. And it's really sad to watch it. And the number of times I get asked questions about this by these old men is less and less and less. So I feel I can say it now. And it clearly matters to their identities, you know, and it's a big thing they did at 11, but they're causing more damage through continuing in this talk about themselves. That's my view.
Hi, my question is also about education. Following the grammar school question, do you think the current policies of VAT on private schools, when the most expensive ones remain relatively unaffected, do you think that's actually reducing inequality? And relative to that, do you think that quite a lot of your 7 children will go to university? Do you think that also will reduce inequality in the long term or not?
Okay, there's 2 questions. I mean, the second one about going to university. So the school I went to, which is still a normal school, where I said 2% went when I went to university, it's now 40 to 50% are going to university. It's still a normal school. The national total by age 30 is 65%. We have the highest proportion in Europe going for at least a day by age 30, 50% by age 18. When I was a child, if my mum and dad had sent me to a Magdalen College school, to be exact, the private school 1 mile away from my school, my chances of going to university isn't the most important thing. I should say this, but yeah, my chances would have been 20 times higher. It would make complete sense for my parents to have paid the money, right? A 20-fold increase in going. Now, if you're in Oxford, you know, and you can help your kid a little bit with, you know, doing their GCSEs. They go to my school, they'll still be going to Manchester or Leeds University. You pay the money, they'll still be going to Manchester or Leeds University. What on earth are you paying for? It is, and this is optimistic. So the second part, universities are partly mixing pools, except, of course, that we have this amazing system in this country, unlike Scotland, and like the rest of Europe, and like the United States, where we go, well, let's take all the children who get A, B, B, and let's put them all together in Sheffield University, because it's ridiculous, the UCAS system, you know. So Bolton School for Girls, set free, comes to Sheffield. I mean, it's and then you're lecturing. A normal European, you go to the University of town, you're teaching your friends' children. You try and teach really, really well, because they're young people. UK English University, well, it's a business. As long as they tick high marks on the student satisfaction survey, you take £9,250 a year off them. Yeah. The VAT, it's really interesting what gets the right wing of Labour. So one of the things that Blair did very early on was get rid of assisted places. We only still have private schools because in the 60s and 70s, the government funded children to go to private schools. They would have died out in this period of great equality because there weren't enough parents who could pay. So there used to be this thing called assisted places where the government would pay your fees. Blair got rid of it, even though he went to Fetters and he apparently had a bad time. Fetters is the Eton of Scotland and a military school. So it looks like a sort of quite radical policy. That was Blair. Starmer, who's hardly radical on anything, in fact, I think the only thing he's done that's radical is the VAT on private schools. And it's like a chip on shoulder kind of thing. What I would do is help to work out what we can do with what used to be our state education system, which has now been privatised. So unelected do-gooders now run academy chains who normally send their children to private schools. Not always, but, well, they quite often have companies with only them and their partner and no employees, because you can look them up. If you have a company with just you and your partner and no employees, it's called tax avoidance normally. Anyway, these are the moral people in charge of our academy change. I don't think it would take much, and not even a lot of money, to improve the state sector to a point it made no sense for large numbers of people who are going. The majority of people who go to private school are struggling to pay the fees of the 7%. So 1% doesn't matter, you could double the fees, they could still go. At the very bottom, no holidays, no savings, nothing else, sometimes privation. And the ridiculousness of living in near poverty so that your child doesn't go to school with the other people on the street. And the saddest thing about it are just things like the amount of drugs in the schools. Because the highest access to drugs are higher in the private schools because the parents have got money. I'm a well-off professor. If my children took £40 out of my wallet, I wouldn't know they'd done it. And £40 lets you buy a bit of diazepam. And my children go to the state school in Oxford, did go, which had the highest drug problem because it had the richest parents. But nothing like the drug problems in the private schools in Oxford. Right? You think you're protecting your child by paying money. And it's not good. And then you're left all your life, or another way of looking at it. Nelson Mandela, the most famous speech of Nelson Mandela's life was given just before the judge had to decide whether to kill him. So just before he was going to be sentenced and he could be hung. And Nelson Mandela, bless him, decided to give a speech that involved educational statistics. And this is about how much money is spent on the average black child in South Africa as opposed to the white children under apartheid in education. And it's about 6 times different, which is similar to our private state difference. Now, you could argue that the wonderful education that the white children of South Africa were getting in the 1950s and 60s, but the tragedy of being brought up under apartheid as a white child, growing up in a country where you're never mixing and know the majority of people that you're with. And the alternative are things like the United States, lower private school uptake, partly because school boards vary so much. But, at the extreme, places like Finland, where you simply go to the nearest school. And on average, you learn 6 languages, and you're better at problem solving, and you're better at maths. The worst lie in Britain about education is the idea that these expensive schools are producing a good education. Right? That's the worst lie. They are getting the grades. That is so different from being in a situation where you know enough that you at 18 can just fly on your own and you don't need any help because you haven't been used to getting much. But you've got to know enough about society because you've been a part of it. And I've spent my life teaching young people, roughly half of whom have gone to private schools. And I felt so sorry for the ones who've gone to private schools. And be honest about it, over this limiting, things you don't know, thinking when you go to guides that you're mixing with normal society. Bless them. And it's not that you're necessarily streetwise if you've gone to state schools, and state schools differ by neighbourhood. But it's an unnecessary division of our children to do this, so that they don't meet until they necessarily go to university or in a nightclub at 18 or 19. Children are not so dangerous to other children that you have to separate them because they're going to infect each other with laziness or something. And we produce the least literate children in Europe, least able to use languages, the worst at problem solving. My favourite stat is when we make them take a GCSE maths test at age 24, we tank it. Because the way we teach maths is if you go to an expensive school or you're in an elite area of London, you're being taught to get an 8 or a 9 at GCSE. And if you go to an average school, you've got to get a 6 or whatever the equivalent of the old C was. So teachers have to teach children this particular trick, like crufts of jumping. And the particular trick is, what do you need to know on that one day to get that 1 grade at maths? So we produce the least able numerically young adults because we're geared up to do it like that. And it's a whole system. We don't let the European authorities, we haven't even before Brexit, we don't let them do basic tests on our undergraduates of ability because of what it would show. You know, we don't say, let's take all the 20-year-olds in my university in Oxford, let's take the 20-year-olds in the University of Sunderland, let's take 20-year-olds who are apprenticeships working on the building site, and let's compare them to other European countries, and let's get them to answer some fairly practical questions. Right? That isn't done under PISA, partly because of what it would actually reveal. Instead, we have a hierarchical education system where our top universities produce leaders who can't actually do anything, but are self-confident enough, and they've all got 3 A's or A stars, that they can lead. You try and hire somebody to actually do some computer programming, and they'll tell you, I can do AI or I can do coding. They can't actually do basic algebra. And if you can't do basic algebra, you can't be a computer programmer. Worse, I've taught American master's students overseas who've boasted to me about how they've done calculus. And I've turned to them and said, could you just tell me what calculus is? And they say, oh no, I don't know what it is, but I know I've got it and it's on my... So, honestly, so I'm frustrated, but you can see, you know, once you make it, the minute you pay for education, it's no longer education. The minute you pay for it, you're buying a good. All we have to do is convince you we've given it to you. Sir, I'll make you a doctorate. Just £100,000, please. Right? The minute you pay for it, you corrupt it. When you're not paying, which is the case in state education, it's the case for most European university education. For the 300,000 overseas students in Germany who don't pay, when you're not paying, you can fail people. You can't fail people if they're paying, right? This really matters for what we're doing in universities, and it matters for Britain because one of our largest export earners is overseas students. So Sheffield exists because of 60,000 overseas students. The metal industry of South Yorkshire makes less money. You might think that's because we've got no metal industry left. It's the arms industry. Okay, it's Rolls-Royce. We still have a metal industry of South Yorkshire, it's just the arms industry. But the overseas students make more money for Sheffield at Hallam and Sheffield University, 60,000 of them. So it keeps the city going. Newcastle, look at the West End of Newcastle. It's a university site built by Chinese money. Look at Glasgow, has the highest number. Manchester. All these cities are reliant on universities, and they're reliant on overseas students. And this is a good thing, except if what you're actually selling is like Dutch tulip bulbs. Right? And it really worries me. I think we could sort it out, work out what we're doing, and realise the actual risks to Britain, given we've got one steel furnace left that's been nationalised yesterday. You know, actually work out, if we don't sort out our school and university education, so it's really education, the idea that we're going to rely on this for 50 to 100 years as our export industry, it could just go overnight, like Swiss boarding schools, if you remember them. Yeah, Switzerland made money out of boarding schools, all the rage in the 70s and 80s. You don't send your child to a boarding school anymore. It's not the thing to do. Now, Switzerland has pharmaceuticals. Right? It's not relying on boarding schools for its money. We are relying on our largest cities, on universities for future employment of people. And you've got to ask, what is it that the universities are actually doing? And how can you make it stable so that this is something which carries on? At the moment, we're sitting pretty because nobody wants to go and be a student in the United States. Right? So it's a good year to think about it. Right? We're getting lots of overseas students, because who wants to fly to the US and be turned away at border control? But that's a temporary situation.
Danny Dorling, thank you ever so much for spending time with us this afternoon. Conway, you've given us an awful lot to think about. Thank you very much, and thank you for